Hello, welcome. We'll start with class 10 political science, the very first chapter that talks about power sharing. Now, as we had talked about in class 9th lectures, class 10th lectures are a continuation for class 9. So, if you have a good fundamental base of class 9, class 10 chapters become very easy. This applies both to political science and history. So, make sure you have a good revision and a good command over the class 9th lectures so as to follow the class 10th lectures carefully. Now, this first topic about power sharing is very simple to understand. Let's take a case study of a school. What happens in a school is you have a kind of hierarchy that we can say. So you have principal that looks after the whole of the school. Then you have section in charge. So let's say the primary section, the middle section, the higher section and the higher secondary section. So those are the various in charge. Then within these primary you would have each and every section would have class teachers. So that's a kind of hierarchy. What is happening here is the power is being shared between the different sections of the school. So you have principal that holds the maximum power, then you have the section in charge, and finally the respective class teachers. Similar to this setup that occurs in a school or any other body that you might be familiar with, we have this power sharing that occurs at a national level. Now this power sharing could be classified under four basic terms or four basic categories, we should say, that we would understand later. For now, let's take two interesting case examples. One is from Belgium and the other is from Sri Lanka. Now both of these studies would help us understand the idea of power sharing, but that would be in a kind of different manner. Now Belgium is a very small nation, smaller than we can say the state of Haryana in India. Now if you look onto the map of Belgium, you would have the French speaking population that resides in Wallonia, and that accounts for nearly 40% of the population. In contrast to that, you have the Dutch speaking population in the Flemish area. You have 59% Dutch speakers. So overall, if you look onto the global picture, and 1% here would be the people who speak German. Now overall, if you look onto the picture of Belgium, the predominant population in Belgium is Dutch speaking, but an interesting contrast exists in the capital of Brussels. Now what happens in the capital of Brussels is you have only 20% people who are Dutch speaking and 80% people who are French speaking. So what happens within the country and within the capital is different. Now to maintain this balance, there were numerous amendments that were released between 1970s to 1993, and of these four basic amendments, the final declaration, we should say, that came out was that each and every speaking language should have an equal representation in the government. So that was the idea that was released in Belgium. Now because of this, Belgium prospered, we can say, and as of now, Belgium is the headquarters for European Union. Now in Belgium, you had the community government that was established. Community government means the government based on, or the group of organization that's based on the language. Now based on the language, you had the community government that was established, which included Dutch, French and German speaking people. All of these were given kind of representation in the government. Now as we said, Belgium has a peaceful history, we can say, because each and every linguistic group was given a proper representation in the government. Since they had a proper representation in the government, the things got much smoother. Now let's talk about a contrast study where you have a majority government that was in power, and because of that majority government, you had the idea of majoritarianism. That means the government in power would have more rules and would give special preference to that sect. Now what happens in Sri Lanka is, if you look onto the map of Sri Lanka again, you have nearly 74% of the people who are Buddhist speaking. So this whole region, you have the Sinhalese population and you have 74% who are speaking Buddhist, and of the remaining you have 18% which are Tamil speakers. Within the Tamil speakers you have the Sri Lankan Tamils and the Indian Tamils. Now these Sri Lankan and Indian Tamils have their own representation. Besides this, you have 7% Christians that are seen, and these 7% Christians are both Tamils as well as Sinhalese. Now within the Tamil, as we said, you have the Sri Lankan Tamil and the Indian Tamil. Sri Lankan Tamil account for nearly 13% of the population, located mainly in the northern and the eastern areas, and the Indian Tamils are those people whose forefathers came to Sri Lanka during the colonial period. So those are the case of Sri Lanka. Now when it got independence in 1948, what happened was, Sinhalese were in majority and they came to power. Now when you had a kind of Sinhalese government that was in power, they were against the Tamilians, and as a result the Tamilians felt much more aggrieved and they were demanding a separate Tamilelam state. Now because you had Sinhalese who were in majority and won the power, they declared certain educational institutions to have special seats or special reservations for Buddhist speaking people. They declared Buddhist as their official language. So there was a kind of huge preferential politics, we could say, that started to develop in Sri Lanka. So as we can see, the state of Belgium and the country of Belgium and Sri Lanka witnessed power sharing, but they had the different routes for the power sharing. In Belgium it was more peaceful, more systematic, and more a kind of generalized view of the people, because as we saw at the national level you had Dutch as a majority, but at the capital Dutch were minority. So they said that be it the national level or be it the city level, we would have equal representations for both the all the speakers residing there. So finally what happened was, the people in the capital city as well as people in the country were happy. But this was not the case for Sri Lanka, where you had Tamil and Sinhalese who were at constant war with one another, leading to civil wars that came up, which led many of the people to refugees. And finally, it was a setback for the common people residing there. Now, as we said, power sharing becomes important, because if you are controlling a bigger area, it's practically not possible for one person to look after the entire region. So definitely at every level you would have power sharing that would occur. Now this power sharing could be prudential as well as moral. Now these two terms are very important, specifically for your questions. What is a difference between a prudential power and a moral power? When we talk about prudential power, we focus more on the outcomes. So let's say we are sharing the power. So will the conflicts come down? Will there be more stability in the political setup? Will the majority not undermine the rights of minority? So those are the kinds of judgments that come under prudential powers. When we are talking about moral outcomes, we emphasize that act of power sharing is more valuable. So we are not focusing on the outcomes right now. Under prudential, we focus or we check out the gains and the losses. So how much benefit would I have if I use this idea of power sharing, and what would be the negative consequences that we could face? However, in moral, we just talk about whether this idea is valuable and how very valuable. So we talk about a good spirit of democracy. We talk about that people must have rights which should be consulted with how they are governed. So people having more rights, having a spirit of democracy is the sole idea under the moral behavior. Now coming on to the forms of power sharing. As we said, we would be focusing on 4 different forms of power sharing. The very first form is the horizontal form of power sharing. In the class 9th lectures, we have talked about 3 pillars of the government. So you have judiciary, executive and legislature. Legislature forms the law, executive executes it, and judiciary resolves any kind of dispute that occurs between them. Now since these are the 3 pillars, this judiciary has its own checks and balances. That means if legislature or executive have some powers or some rules that have come up, this judiciary has a power to check it as and when required. So that's one of the most interesting features that you have under the horizontal distribution of power. Again, with the horizontal distribution of power, you have much more dispersal of power that occurs during the emergency purposes. And a good example that has been mentioned in NCERT is the Bombay High Court ordered the Maharashtra government to take an action to improve the living conditions of 2000 odd children homes in Mumbai. So that's a kind of horizontal distribution of power. The next is the federal government. Now this federal government and federalism would be our next chapter, the second chapter in the political science that we would be discussing again. Now what happens in the federal government? Under the federal government, you have 2 forms. So you have a center and a state. So let's say you have India here. So one would be the government that would be ruling the whole of the country, and the other would be the government that would be ruling the individual states. Now these states are being ruled by the state government, and then you have certain decisions which are coming up under the central government. So you have 2 forms of federal governments coming together, federalism and holding together. We will be talking about coming together and holding together federalism in the next lecture. So where we will be discussing class 2. So that again becomes important. The third form of power sharing is the community government. Community government is a classic example as we saw in the case of Belgium. So what happens is certain minority groups, certain languages are given power so as to represent themselves or have their say. Let's say we provide reservation to certain communities so that they can have their own say or stake. So in the last class, in class 9th, we talked about reserved constituencies. So under reserved constituencies, what happens is there is a government that is in majority, and we try to focus on improving the scenario of that region by electing a representative who belongs to that community. So that's what is a kind of community government that we talk about. And similarly, a good example is the Ontario example from Canada, where the minister announced the government to work with the tribal peoples or the aboriginal peoples. The next is the coalition government. Now coalition government is another very interesting aspect. Let's talk about the center. You have 5 parties that are contesting an election. Now what happens is you have party A, B, C, D and E, and let's say there are 500 seats. In the first case, party A gets 300 seats. So we can say party A is in majority, and even if all other parties unite together, they would have only 200 seats. So they cannot have a say in the government, and finally party A is elected to power. So this becomes a kind of unitary government where single government would be at power. However, there would be a case where, let's say you have 100 seats for this, 80, 80, 80, so 80, 80, 80, you have 240, 340 and 160. So you have these number of seats that are there for each party. Now what would happen is, you would say that okay, certain party, even if they come together, there would be at least 3 parties that should come together to form a majority, more than 50%. So these parties, let's say A, B, C, join together to form a majority government. And when you have more than 2 parties that come together to form a government, we call it a coalition government. So this is an example of a coalition government. So under coalition government, you have an example from Russia where you have the union of right forces and the liberal movement that united together to form the right-wing coalition. Similarly, you had the VP Singh's government in India. That was a good example of coalition government. Till then, we did not witness numerous coalition governments in India. So, 4 types of power sharings we have talked about. The horizontal distribution of power, which talks about the 3 pillars, the legislative, executive and the judiciary. Then you have power sharing based on the federal structure. So, you have federal government, the powers divided between the center and the state. The next we came across was the community government, and the last was the coalition government. As we promised in the previous chapters, we will be discussing some important questions. So, the first important question would be, what is the difference between prudential and moral power sharing basis, and why power sharing is desirable? So, these 2 questions are important. Then you have the next question, what are the various forms of power sharing? What is a coalition government? What is a difference between a community government and a coalition government? So all those topics we have discussed. Whenever you are writing your answers, you can substantiate the answers and the concepts with examples, so that would give the answers a good weightage. We will be discussing further lectures of political science in the upcoming classes. As promised, we aim to finish the class 10 political science and history before your board exams for social sciences. Have a very good day ahead. Welcome. We'll start with the second chapter for political science, where we would talk about federalism. Now, in the last chapter of political science, we have talked about 4 different types of power sharing. The one was the horizontal distribution of power. The second was the idea of federal structure of the government. The third was the community government, and the fourth was the coalition government. So, we will focus on federalism for now. As we talked about in the last class, federalism talks about division of power between center and the state. So let's say we have numerous issues that we need to discuss about. It can be defense, it can be agriculture, it can be education, so on and so forth. So what we do is, we decide, okay, let's say defense would be looked after by the center, agriculture would be looked after by the state, and so on. So what happens is, the ruling becomes much more easy, the execution process becomes much more efficient. So that's the sole idea under the structure of federalism. We saw in Belgium how the unitary form of the government slowly and gradually, after amendments between 1970 to 1993, shifted to a kind of federal structure where equal representations were given to both the sects or both the linguistic groups. Similarly, under federal structure, what we do is, let's say central government would have so and so powers, state government would have so and so powers. We usually say that state government would look after the day-to-day functioning, the day-to-day administration at the local level, at the state level. However, center has much fewer subjects of more importance. However, the idea of federalism differs from state to state and country to country. So, later on in this section, we would be focusing specifically on India. Let's first talk about the idea of federalism and the benefits. So, if we look onto the world map, here out of the 192 states, you have 25 nations that have federal structure of the government, and these contribute to 40% of the population worldwide. So that's definitely a huge amount, and mostly, as you can see, bigger nations who are bigger in size, bigger in dimensions, usually have a federal structure, so that the ruling becomes, or the execution of power becomes much more efficient and better. Now, what are the basic features of federalism? First of all, as we said, there would be division of power between the center and the state. Now, taxes would be collected, or revenue we should say would be collected separately at the state level and the center level, or if it's collected at one level, it would be divided for the center and the state in certain ratio or certain amount. Each body, the center and the state, would have their own jurisdictions. So let's talk about India. So let's say in India, at the national level you would have Supreme Court, at the state level you would have High Court. So that's the kind of jurisdiction that would be seen at each and every level. If there is requirement for the fundamental change in the constitutional provisions, both the center and the state should have their say and should have their yes basically to make that change in the constitution ultimately. It brings in more unity, tries to protect the regional diversity of each and every region, and maintains a mutual trust and agreement. Now there are two basic forms of federalism that exist. This is a very important question. You have the coming together federalism and holding together federalism. In coming together federalism, we say you have independent states that are there and they try to maintain their own identity and sovereignty and increase their security by coming together. That could be seen in the nations of Australia, Switzerland and America. So all the states have equal power. They are as strong as the federal government. But in India, this is not the case. In India, we have a holding together federalism. Holding together federalism implies that the country is divided into states, but the center would allot the center would divide the powers between the state and the center. So that's a basic difference between the coming together federalism and a holding together federalism. So let's talk about, for example, America. You have coming together federalism. So each of the state, be it the state of California, be it the state of New York or Oregon, each would have their own government and own constitution. However, when we talk about holding together federalism, as in India, you have the center which is much stronger than the respective state governments, and it would basically try to divide powers or say that okay, state should need to look after these and these issues. So those two types of federal governments or federation are really very important to understand. Now let's come on to India. That's the major section that we would be talking about, or the major study that we would be doing. Now in India, we have division of powers at 3 levels. All the powers that reside with the center are known as the union list or the central powers or the powers with the central government. The next is the powers that you have with the state that fall under the state list, and some of the powers are equally divided between the center and the state, and those goes to the concurrent list. So that's the division of power. Now coming on to the division of the government. At the center you have the central government. Then you have the state which has the state government, and then you have the local government. So local government can be RLG or ULG, that's the rural local government or the urban local government, which came up under the 73rd and 74th Amendment Act of the Constitution. Now at the center, as we say, we have the Prime Minister, we have the President of the country, and we have the Parliament. In the state level, we have the Chief Minister, we have the Legislative Assembly and the Vidhan Sabha and the Vidhan Parishad in certain cases. So you have that occurs at the state level, and then at the local level you have the village panchayat, you have the panchayat samiti that we will discuss later. Now when there was the division of powers between center, state and concurrent list, what happened was, after this was done, there were certain subjects that came up. Now since these were already declared that this power or this ministry or this department would go to center, this would go to state, and so on and so forth, what would happen to the things that came after the constitution was written? For example, computer softwares. Now computer softwares was neither the part of central government nor the part of state government, because it was not a concept till the constitution came up. So finally what happened was, it was put into the residuary powers. Now residuary powers are those powers that are seen up or that are governed only by the center. So all the residuary powers are looked after by the union government, and computer software, since it came after the constitution was written, you have it lying in the residuary subjects. Now you have the list of the union list, the state list and the concurrent list as we discussed, and some of the subjects that are, some of the departments that are part of union list, state list and concurrent list. The next important topic is, in India we say we have a federal structure which is holding together. The only state that has a separate constitution in India is Jammu Kashmir. So Jammu Kashmir has certain provisions. For example, a person who is not domiciled of that region cannot buy or sell land in that region. The next is the union territories. We say we have 29 states and 7 union territories. So those 7 union territories fall directly under the central government. They are not looked after by the state, or they do not have the powers as the states have. For any change that need to occur in any of these arrangements, what happen is both the houses must have 2/3 of the majority. So when we talk about both houses, it's Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, and then it should be ratified by the legislatures of the states with at least 50% of the people who are accepting that ratification. When it comes to judiciary, we talk about resolution of disputes, solving of problems. So under resolution of disputes, we say at the center level we have the Supreme Court. However, at the state level you have the high courts that come up. Now how do we practice federalism? Federalism is commonly seen in the democratic politics of a state or of a nation. In India, we initially started the division based on the language groups. So we had Andhra speaking people who demanded for a separate state. Then came up Marathis, Tamils, so on and so forth. So the initial division of India, after the independence, we had the division that came up on the linguistic basis. Despite that, we have certain states that are classified on the basis of culture, ethnicity, or the geographical conditions of that region. For example, Nagaland, you have Jharkhand, Uttarakhand, and so on. The last state that got separated was Telangana, that became a separate state in 2014 in India. So India basically follows a language policy. So when we say language policy, we say Hindi is the official language, but for all judicial purposes, English would remain the official language or the basic language. There are 21 other languages that have been recognized in the scheduled languages of India. Now, if we look around, we have nearly 1500 distinct languages, 114 major languages, but in the category of scheduled languages that are listed on the currency notes, that are listed in the constitution, we have these 22 languages that were part of the 8th schedule. Now, Hindi is the most popular of that. 40% of the population have the first language as Hindi. If we include the people who have their second language and the third language is Hindi, it comes to nearly 50%. But when it comes to English, it's only 0.02% who have English as their first language. But English coming up or becoming the second and the third language, you have 11% of the population. So most of the things that were non-Hindi states were starting to believe that Hindi should not be the official language of a country, because if that happens, we need to have our separate existence or a separate state. So government favored these conditions, and finally there was a ruling that said that all official documents and all judicial documents would remain in English. So therefore, center-state relations become very, very important. As we saw after 1990s, we witnessed coalition governments in India. So regional parties try to come together and form a government at the center level. Till then, you had a single party that was winning the elections and was coming into power. Now, decentralization in India. So, decentralization started with the Ashok Mehta committee, where we talked about decentralization at the rural level and the urban level. So, primarily it was for the rural bodies. Under the rural areas or the rural local bodies, we have 1/3 of the seats that have been reserved for the female candidates. So power is being taken from the state to the local people. So once you have the local people who are coming into power, they have more representation, more decentralization and more power that could be attained by them. So it became mandatory later on to hold regular elections for local bodies, to have reservation for ST/SC and women at local level, and you have the Panchayati Raj system that evolved. Now Panchayati Raj system, what it is, it's very interesting to understand. First of all, in the Panchayati Raj system, you have the lowest level, which is the village. So at the village you have the Gram Panchayat that is seen. Now this Gram Panchayat would have Panchayat, so Panch means 5. So you would have Sarpanch and the other members of the ward which are known as Panch, which would be the part of this Gram Panchayat. They are elected directly by the people and they take the decisions directly for the people. They approve the budget and review the performance. Above the village level, you have the Panchayat Samiti, or which is also known as the block or the mandal. It is the group of various villages coming together. So you have various villages that came together and this formed a block or a mandal or Samiti. Now this Samiti, the members are elected by the Panchayat members of each village. So 5 members from this, 5 from this, 5 from this, together will elect the members at the district level. They form the Zilla Parishad. Now this Zilla Parishad have their own elected members. Sometimes they can be MLAs or MPs, and then you have the Zilla Person Chairman, that's the political head of the Zilla Parishad. Similarly to the local area, the rural areas, you have the urban areas where you have municipalities. If it is a bigger urban area, you would have municipal corporations that would be seen. In the municipalities, you have the chairman, which is the head. In the municipal corporations, you have mayor, which is the head of the municipal corporations. Now, what is the institution of Zilla Parishad? As we discussed, Zilla Parishad is the political head. Now, when we say the division of power, you have the district magistrate and the Zilla Parishad. What's the difference between the role of the two? District magistrate is chaired by a non-political head. So, he is basically a civil servant or an administrative head. The decision making is done by the Zilla Parishad. The execution is done by the district magistrate. Now, the chairman of Zilla Parishad comes under the collector or the district magistrate, but above the additional collector. A good example of division of power is seen in the city of Porto Alegre in Brazil. So what happened was, you had the decentralization with participative government or participative democracy that was seen in Brazil. What happened was, the different wards, the city was divided into wards or sectors, and each sector had its own meeting. So buses now run into poor colonies, and builders cannot basically have slum dwellers without resettling them. So all those developments came in the city because of the active division of power and the involvement of local people into the budget and allocation of resources, so that even the common man and the poor gets the maximum benefit out of it. Coming on to the questions from this chapter, the first important question is, what is the difference between coming together federation and holding together federation? Why India is a holding together federation? That becomes the second most important question. The third important question is, what is the characteristic feature of a federal government? The difference between a federal government and a unitary government, explained with examples. Then a very important short question or a kind of objective question is, what are residuary powers? Who looks after the residuary powers in India? And again a small question can be, what is concurrent list? So those are the important questions that could be taken out from this chapter. We would be covering the further chapters of political science. We will complete political science first for class 10th, and then we will move on to the history for the remaining chapters of history class 10. So stay tuned to our channel. If you have any doubts, you are free to jot them down as comments below the video. Have a very good day ahead. Welcome. We'll start with the third chapter for political science class 10th. In this chapter, we'll talk about democracy and diversity. Now, a good example to start with is an example of the Olympics that were held in Mexico in 1968. Now, in this Olympics, you had two blacks, Smith and Carlos, who won the medal, but were later their medals were taken aback. Now, Norman was a white from Australia, but he supported the cause of Smith and Carlos. Both of these belonged to different races. You had blacks and whites, but these whites were supporting the cause of blacks. So there existed diversity, but still they were trying to bring in a kind of unity into the system. Now the similar examples we'll see later when we'll talk about the case of North Ireland and Netherlands, how things have been different in the two countries. Coming back to this concept, Norman, when he supported the cause of Smith and Carlos that was predominantly against the idea of racial discrimination, you had these Smith and Carlos who were later supporting Norman, and it was during the funeral ceremony of Norman, both of them were part of it. Now, when we talk about views about something, these views definitely differ. So, let's talk about two predominant aspects, the caste and race. So, when we talk about caste, it's a kind of social division that exists in the society, but when we talk about race, race is a biological difference. So under race, we say you have Caucasoids, you have Mongolites. So all these are different races, and these differ on a biological basis. Now some of the people are of the opinion that these races also have legal differences, they also have sociological differences. But predominantly we say you have biological differences that is seen when we talk about races, and when we talk about caste, we have social differences. In the next chapter, we will see how these differences based on caste, race and gender are being seen in the day-to-day politics. In the first chapter, we talked about the case studies of Belgium and Sri Lanka. We have seen that how in Sri Lanka, the differences based on the linguistic groups, based on the religion were very predominant. However, in the case of Belgium, those differences were not that predominant. So, those are the things that differ on a day-to-day basis and region to region, and those differences needs to be evolved or needs to be checked over the time. So you have the origin of various social differences that we will understand in the next section. So when we talk about origin of social differences, the first could be based on the birth. So when we say based on the birth, that means if I am born in a religion X, I would automatically be follower of religion X, because since birth I have been trained in that religious community or that religious sect. The second is by choice. So let's say you have been practicing religion X till the age of 9 or 10 years, but after that you come in acquaintance with another religion and you find that religion more interesting or more better than the other religion, you might switch to that religion. Many of the people are of the opinion that religion unites people, but when you have the religion that acts as a uniting force, there are also divisions based on the religion that are being seen, and these are known as overlapping or cross-cutting differences. Now when we talk about overlapping or cross-cutting differences, what does it mean? We'll understand the example of North Ireland and Netherlands here. So both North Ireland and Netherlands have a predominant Christian population, and you have Catholics and Protestants that are predominantly present in both the regions. Now what happens in North Ireland is there are frequent clashes between the Catholics and the Protestants. However, in Netherlands they live closely and in good harmony with each other. Now how does this difference takes place? This difference that exists is what we call as the overlapping or the cross-cutting differences. So this differs based on the social group, based on the various local practices that exist, based on the social divisions that exist. Similarly, if we talk about America, we say blacks have been discriminated since long. There had been racial discrimination that was common. Blacks were considered poor, homeless and were discriminated. Similarly in India, if we come on to, we have the untouchables or the Dalits that were being called as, and those are being discriminated and there is injustice that is being seen. So these differences lead to different viewpoints. Now cross-cutting differences are easier to accommodate because let's say you have the cross-cutting differences which is seen here, it's very easy to accommodate, but where there are overlapping differences, there are deeper social divisions. So overlapping differences could be both Catholics and Protestants are following Christianity, but within the same sect or within the same religion, there comes up differences, and once there you have the differences, it gets more deeper. Similarly in Sweden, in Germany, you have the local population that's more or less homogeneous, but there is intermingling or incoming of numerous migrant population, and because of that you have a kind of multicultural nations that are coming up. Including India, including other nations, you have multicultural nations that are being developing. And when you have a multicultural nation that has been developing, you have the social divisions that come up, but these social divisions should not influence the politics, and if they do, there is a kind of communalization of the politics that takes place, and your country or your nation cannot remain a secular state. So that we will talk about in the next chapter as we move forward. Now we would cover on to the next topic, that is the politics of social division. Now when we talk about the politics of social division, we say there is division in the society. Now this division could be based on gender, could be based on caste, could be based on race or religion, but ultimately, if there is a division or a break in the society, what all things it could lead to? First, it could lead to conflicts. Secondly, it could lead to violent activities or violence, we can say. And thirdly, and most importantly, it could lead to disintegration, and that happened in India during the time of India-Pakistan partition, we could say. And that is the worst of these, where you have to witness kinds of riots, massacres and so on. So those are the things that are being affected when you have social division that takes a predominant role in the politics. Let's talk about the case study of United Kingdom. Now in United Kingdom or UK, what happens is you have 53% Protestant population and 44% Catholics that are seen. Now this 53% Protestants are represented by the party or the Unionists. On the other hand, this 44% Catholics are represented by the Nationalist Party. So you have two parties, the Unionist and the Nationalist, that are seen here. Now, when there was a kind of war that break out between the Unionist and the Nationalist, the UK government was trying to reach a peace treaty, and in 1998, Nationalist basically reached a peace treaty and they suspended all the kind of armed struggle that existed so far. So ultimately there need to be some kind of a way in between which could lead to peaceful resolution between the various social divisions, or else it would lead to civil rights, civil wars and so on. Yugoslavia, you had a similar example. So you had political competition that was among the various religions, predominantly the ethnic centers. We have also talked about the Kosovo province of Yugoslavia. Now this led to disintegration of Yugoslavia into 6 independent nations, and politics and social division was a key aspect for that. Now let's consider a world without social division. Now if definitely there is no kind of social division based on caste, religion or any other parameter, what would be the outcome? The outcome would be the best outcome that we could see, because if there is no division, there could be no conflicts, no wars, no disintegration, no violence. But even if that does not exist, even if there are social divisions that exist in the society, there has to be a way forward where there is a peaceful existence for each and every social division that is existent or that is present in the society. And when there is a peaceful existence, then only we can say the politics would not be affected by the social divisions that exist. So social divisions, even if they exist, should not affect the politics, because if it affects the politics, it would affect the voting behavior. Ultimately, it would affect the people who come into power and might lead to disintegration of the nation. Now, what are the outcomes of politics on social divisions? So, when we talk about outcomes of politics on social divisions, there are 3 predominant outcomes. The first is people perceive their identities. So, it's how you try to associate yourself with, or how you try to build out your personality. So, if I say I need to stand singular, I don't want to join any of the political parties that is inclined to any of the social sects. Now, what would happen if I stand as an independent candidate? If I stand as an independent candidate, even if I win or if I get votes in a particular constituency or an area, I would not be able to express myself at a state level or a national level, since I am not able to form a big political party that's required for your democratic setup. So, when you try to have multiple identities that exist, there is a kind of peaceful coexistence that could be seen. The next is, so first was how you perceive your identities. The next was how political leaders raise the demand for the community. So let's say if all the political parties or all the political leaders are pressurizing for a specific community or a specific sect, that sect would get representation or would get some undue powers or that are not meant for, or that should be meant for other minorities or other groups as well. But what would happen as an outcome? The outcome would be the other communities that are residing in the country would be unhappy, and then again it would lead to further violence and conflicts. The last is how government reacts to the demands. So when we talk about the political leaders raising the demand, a good example is the case of Sri Lanka that we discussed in chapter 1 again, where you had a demand for a separate Tamilalam state. Now, if we talk about the government's reaction to the demand, we can see the case that happened in Belgium, where government started with the idea of community government, where each and every religion or language people could be represented into the mainstream, and therefore it would make the things less threatening and lead to lesser disintegration. So, social differences are acceptable up to a level, but if these social differences try to affect the politics, those become unacceptable, and if the things further worsen off, it could lead to disintegration of a country or a province or a region, as it happened in the case of Yugoslavia, as it happened in India post-partition. So those are the things that we need to look about when we talk about social divisions and politics. Definitely, social division is an integral part of politics, and we cannot separate it while studying the idea of political science. In the next chapter, we will talk about three basic concepts: the religion, caste and gender that affect the politics. So stay tuned for further lectures in political science. We plan to cover it in the coming months, so class 10 political science and history should be completed within a month's frame. Have a very good day ahead. Welcome. We'll start with the fourth chapter for NCERT class 10th. Now this chapter focuses on gender, religion and caste. We have seen how religion played a major role, and sometimes within the same religion, as we saw the case of North Ireland, we had division among Catholics and Protestants, and it was a kind of disturbance that was seen there. However, a reverse was seen in Netherlands, where the two communities lived in peace. But in this chapter, we would focus on the social differences. The three major social differences that we would talk about are gender, caste and religion. So we will talk about those one by one. Coming on to gender, most of the work that is associated with the household is considered to be the responsibility for the females. However, if the same work is being paid for, men are ready to accept that as a job only if it is a paid labor. Again, there are numerous differences that exist in the society. Now, these could be in the form of early dropouts in the school, sex selection. Then you have a kind of education or literacy level that's higher for the males as compared to the females. Again, when we talk about the equal remuneration, although we have the Act for Equal Remuneration, females are paid less off as compared to males. So all those are the issues that we have been trying to focus in this chapter, and those are the reasons which basically govern a kind of patriarchal society. Recently, in the Economic Survey 2018, we had one of the chapters in volume 1 which focused on son meta preference and the kind of unwanted girls concept. So those are the things that we need to work around in the society. Another important news recently was the decline in the sex ratio in 17 of the 21 states, with the highest decline seen in the state of Gujarat. So all those are some of the examples that we need to work around in India. Contrast to this, let's talk about Scandinavian countries. In Scandinavian countries, you have a very high work participation rate for the females. IMF have laid down the data in which they have said that if the women work participation in India increases, it could impact the economic growth, and we could have a kind of 27% rise in the economic growth. So those are the kind of things we need to work around. As considering these facts, there were lots and lots of feminist movements that started, which mainly worked around providing more education opportunities, providing more employment or career opportunities, and improvement or enhancement in the personal life. So those were the things that we have talked about. Now coming on to the representation of females in the parliament. Now this graph shows a world picture, and we have a world average of 19.7, of which you have the Nordic countries which have a very high female participation in the parliament with around 42. However, in India this is only 10. So the another concept that comes up here is, if there is more female participation in the politics, in the political setup, that would help female come up in different fields and different walks of life. So if this participation or this ratio is increased for India, definitely we would witness a higher work participation across India. For 2009 Lok Sabha elections, only 10% of the female workforce was there, or the female were elected. However, if it works for the states, it's only 5%. Now again, if there is a chief minister or prime minister who is a female, most of the cabinet comes out to be the male members. So therefore, the execution is not up to that level, and this needs to be improved. Considering this in focus, we have improved the female reservation, or we have talked about women reservation in the local level. So 1/3 of the seats would be reserved for women in the Gram Sabhas and the Gram Panchayat. So that's something that has been done at the grassroots level or the local level governance, we could say. And the important thing that comes up is, if we say casteism and communalism are bad, then why do we say that feminism is a good thing? So that's again a kind of reservation, but providing only reservation is not an answer to this solution, to this question. What we need to work around is improve the education standard, improve the health facilities, improve the basic standards of living, and the basic change the mental makeup or the mindset of the people. The next important thing that we would focus today is religion, and the last would be the caste. Under religion, in India we talk about a secular state where we say each and everyone has a freedom to profess their own religion. They have a freedom to convert their religion or to adopt any other religion of their choice, and as a country we do not say that this country has a following religion. For example, we say Buddhism in Sri Lanka, we say Islam in Pakistan, but India does not offer any kind of religion by the government. So in India we have kept government and religion on the separate ends, and politics has nothing to do with the two. So that's the important thing that we need to talk about here. Now Gandhiji used to say that religion can never be separated from politics. Now there are different viewpoints by different scholars, by different personalities who have come up, but his main idea here was only to focus on the moral values and the ethical values. There are numerous human rights activists who talk about the victims of communal violence and communal rights, and during the partition of India and Pakistan, India witnessed huge losses. Considering that in mind, we finally believe that we would not have a kind of communal politics that exists in a country. Now, when does communal politics come into action? Communal politics comes into action when you have a set of people who are following a specific religion, a huge number of followers of those sects, their interests should be same. Then once their interests are different within the community, there can be involvement of conflict. So let's say if you have within the community, the example of North Ireland again, you had within the Christians, you had Catholics and Protestants, but there was conflict within the same religion that came up. So all voices from the same religion should work around the same thing, and then only you could have a communal politics that could take place. And if there is a kind of extreme form of communal politics, it could lead to basically predominance of a specific religion that could harm or deteriorate the conditions for other religions to remain there or to be part of that country. So those are the things that we talk about under communal politics. Now, how does communalism takes form of politics? So communalism takes form of politics when the religious communities and beliefs are considered superior to other communities. So let's say there are two communities, A and B. A considers themselves superior to B. So then there would be a kind of communal mindset that since we are superior, we need to dominate. The other is the quest for political dominance. That's one of the main ideas. Many of the people work around only in the name of religion to attain political power or political dominance. Political mobilization on religious ground is another thing. So you have religious leaders, you have religious symbols, you have religious and emotional appeals that takes place, and in extreme form it could lead to violence. So these are the things that we need to work around under communal politics, and therefore we talk about a secular state. As we said, under secular state we do not have any official religion of the state. We have freedom to profess the religion of our choice. We are free to adopt or convert to another religion based on our preferences. There is no discrimination on the basis of religion to any of the persons in the country, and state would not intervene in any of the religious matter. It would intervene only if there are questions of equality that are being challenged. The last topic that we would be covering today is the caste. Now under caste system, when we talk about two major castes, that is the SCs and the STs, the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. Scheduled tribes or the Adivasis are those who have been living a kind of secluded lives in the villages, the forest areas, and they do not interact with the common man. Scheduled caste on the other hand were considered as Dalits, and they were regarded as outcasted previously in the Hindu social order, and they were basically excluded from the mainstream and not treated at par with the others. So those were the castes which were having a kind of differences or the differences among the society that existed based on the caste hierarchy. Later on you had the OBCs or the other backward classes. However, if we look onto the census data, census does not count for OBCs. NSSO, that's the National Sample Survey Organization, has done a round and in which they have talked about 41% of the OBCs in India. If SC, ST and OBC are taken together, it accounts for 2/3 of India's population and 3/4 of the Hindu population. There have been numerous reformers like Jyotiba Phule, Gandhiji, B.R. Ambedkar, you have Periyar Ramaswamy Naicker, who have worked for the cause of upliftment of the SC, STs and the OBCs. However, there has been a sudden change or a kind of change in the mindset of the people with the advent of urbanization, with more mobility of the people, changes in the occupational pattern, increase in the level of literacy, education, and weakening of the feudal system of landlords. So those are some of the causes that have led to uprooting the idea of caste system that has been deep rooted in the Indian society since long. So those systems basically have taken apart the problems of the caste system, but still there are certain rituals that are followed. For example, marriages within the caste, the idea of untouchability in certain areas, that has not been completely ended. Some of the castes are considered untouchables, so they are not given the right to the land. Other castes are considered as twin born, so they have the right to education. So there are kind of disproportionately bigger upper class or the upper caste, and you have the disproportionately less proportion of the untouchables and the SC, STs, which are at the stake of the upper caste, which is higher in number or bigger in number. Now caste takes into politics when people choose to represent their representatives. So let's say if I am from a caste X, I would prefer a person who is elected would be from the caste X. If that happens, then we can say we are affecting the politics, or the caste is taking into the politics. And once you have a person X from a specific caste who is being elected, that person can believe or have undue favors to that caste. But this process does not last long. There are few reasons for it. First of all, under a democratic setup as in India, no party wins the election for more than 2 or 3 terms. So every time you have a change in the person who comes to the power, and therefore even if there is caste politics that occurs for a period or a small percentage of time, that would not affect in the bigger run. Again, no party can win only on the basis of a specific caste. Let's say 80% of the people from this constituency are from a specific caste, but it's not required that all 80% would vote to that individual from the same caste. Again, if they are voting, there could be a kind of larger proportion of vote from that caste, but in a broader picture amongst all other constituencies, that proportion becomes negligible. Many of the political parties do not put the candidates from the same caste, considering the fact that if they put that, there would be a question on the political party. Some of the candidates put the person from the same caste for the sake of vote bank, but it may or may not turn out to be successful. But as we said, since you have the leaders or the representatives who rotate or who keep on changing with every term, this caste based politics or communal based politics cannot stay for long. Again, there is one major issue with the caste politics. The major issue is there is a caste, that caste tries to get bigger and bigger, and since it's getting bigger, it tries to incorporate other castes within its dimensions, and so there is a formation of coalition that could be seen. Now this coalition or a bigger group which is created by the smaller groups comes into power, and this group would have the backward caste, the forward caste, the rich, the poor, the males and the females, and slowly and gradually there would be a kind of bigger representation of the people. But again, when there is a kind of coalition government, it cannot survive for long, as it does not have the absolute powers. So the idea ultimately is to bring end to all kind of discriminations, and particularly which are against the human dignity and which have a direct impact on a common people. So the attention to the caste system, communal politics, checking out the corruption, bringing in more transparency, accountability and responsibility in the government, that is the art of the governance that we say. A for accountability, R for responsibility and T for transparency. That's the sole idea to be brought into the politics and into the governance. So with this we cover the 4th chapter of political science. We will be covering the remaining 4 chapters in the upcoming classes, most probably before your upcoming board examinations. Have a very good day ahead. Welcome. We'll start with chapter 5 for political science class 10th. In this chapter we'll talk about the various popular struggles and movements. The first topic that we would cover is the Nepal's right or Nepal's movement. Now Nepal was one of the countries that faced the third wave of freedom. Now under the third wave countries, when we talk about, we have the countries who had a search for democracy from a kind of monarchy or a dictatorship that they've witnessed, and this was mainly during the period of post 1974. So during 1974 to 1990s you had the third phase, the third wave countries that were popular, and Nepal is one of the good examples of it. Now what initially happened was, initially there was the head of the state or the monarch that was ruling, and it was in the name of King Birendra. And this King Birendra was killed in one of the royal massacres in 2001. After that, King Gyanendra came to power, but he was not willing to accept the democratic rule in the state of, in the country of Nepal. What happened was, there was a kind of dismissal of the parliament that took place, and the Prime Minister was dismissed, finally there were major political parties that formed SPA, that was 7-party alliance, where 7 of the major parties came together, and there was a kind of 4-day strike in Kathmandu, following which there was a kind of strike that was led by basically the Nepalese Communist Party. And under this Nepalese Communist Party, the idea was a kind of Maoist inflow, where this was under the leadership of Mao of China, and the idea was to bring in people or to overthrow government by armed rebellion. So after an armed rebellion, you can definitely overthrow a government, and that was the sole basic idea that they were trying to follow. Finally, this Maoist insurgency led to a kind of democratic movement in Nepal, and you had democracy that was resumed, and on 24th April 2006, Giriraj Prasad Koirala became the new Prime Minister for the interim government that was held, and this was known as the Nepal's second movement for democracy. Now similar to this, you had a kind of Bolivian water wars that took place. Now Bolivia is an interesting country lying in Latin America. So when we talk about Latin America, it includes, so you have the North Americas, the Central America and the South America. So both the Central and the South America together are known as Latin America. And under this you had Bolivia. Bolivia is basically a landlocked country, and since it's a landlocked country, it do not have its own water resources. Most of the water that was available in this country was through the government supplies, and one day government decided to basically follow this or forward this to a kind of MNC or a private company. As a result, what happened here was there was a sudden price rise. Following the price rise, the people's movement started, and there was a 4-day strike that was led by the community leaders and the local leaders there. The MNC contract was ultimately cancelled, and water supply was restored by the government at the older rates, which were the nominal rates. Now whenever we talk about these issues, there comes an issue of a popular struggle. Now this popular struggle could be in two forms. It could be a issue based or a kind of general revolution. This general would also be known as a kind of generic idea. Now when we talk about issue based, I can say Narda Bachao Andolan is one of the issue based popular struggle, where we are only focusing about the building of dam or raising the level of waters for the Narmada river. And the construction of dam, increasing the height of the dam. So that's specifically to the Narmada river and the dam project on the Narmada river. Then similarly you have anti-liquor movement, that's again a kind of issue based movement. When we talk about a general or a generic movement, it would be a kind of women movement or a women empowerment drive. So that would be a kind of general movement. So popular struggles could be finally or broadly classified as issue based movements or general or generic movements. Now whenever you have a popular struggle, what happens is under a conflict you have two groups, one who is in power and the other who is trying to attain the power. So there is a conflict between one who is existingly in power and the other who is trying to attain power. So the one who is in power is dominating the scene right now, but this party is trying to have a kind of balance or trying to bring themselves up to the level where you can say the party who is in power is dominant. So this requires a kind of mass mobilization. So mass mobilization becomes very, very important, and for this mass mobilization definitely there would be people's participation or the participation of the common man, without which you cannot have a kind of active mass mobilization that could be seen. Again, this mass participation could be seen in the competitive politics, and this influences the election procedure and the government that is being formed. Again, there are indirect participations that are seen. These are from the organizations who are promoting the group, who are acting together without forming a kind of organizations. But again you have pressure groups. Now there are definite advantages and disadvantages of pressure groups. When we talk about pressure groups, these are small groups who are not involved directly into the politics, but they are trying to influence the government policies or the government decisions. So Narmada Bachao Andolan is a kind of pressure group under Meera Patkar, which is trying to restrict the height of the dam that is being built on Narmada. So that's a kind of pressure group that is coming into action with a common objective. So all the people who are working for that pressure group would have a common objective or common ideology in mind. Now these influence politics rather than the direct participation in a competition. So whenever you have a kind of pressure groups, that would affect the politics at a deeper level as compared to direct participation. A good example is from Indonesia, where nearly 15,000 landless farmers from the West Java region protested that if they are not given any land, they would not vote, and they were asked to boycott the first direct presidential elections that were held, and they said that unless and until we are given the lands, we would not give vote to any of the presidential candidate, whoever is contesting the election. So that's a kind of involvement or a kind of pressure group that deepens its root. Now again, when you talk about pressure groups, there are certain interest groups that come into power. These interest groups could be sectional, that means they are favoring a particular section of the society. So let's say they are favoring a particular religion, a particular minority group, or a particular ethnic or cultural group. Now when they are favoring that interest group, one good aspect would be definitely that interest group would have an opportunity to rise or do better. But on the other hand, there would be another drawback that would be witnessed, and that drawback would be that interest group could be overpowered and it could affect the functioning of others in the society. So public interest groups or promotional groups are again important. A good example is the FEDECOR group in Bolivia, which worked for the water issues and focused on a kind of collective interest of the group behavior to work around the MNC that was raising the prices of the water in Bolivia. Similarly, you have BEMSEF, that is Backward and Minority Communities Employee Federation. Now this is an federation that is made up of government employees and that discriminates or that have a kind of momentum against the caste discrimination that occurs. Now there are various movement groups that we already talked about. So movement groups could be issue specific or general or generic movement groups. Then how these pressure groups influence the politics? The first is they provide support and sympathy to a specific group of people. So they have a kind of common goal that they are working for. They help in organizing the strikes and the protest activities. So workers organizations, trade unions, employee associations are good examples for those. The next is they often have or they kind of employ professional lobbyists, and when they are employing professional lobbyists, it is a kind of expensive advertisement they are doing, and this expensive advertisement could be met by a kind of section of group, but that could affect the functioning of other official bodies in the government because those are not spending as much as this specific interest group or a political group is. Again, they have certain political ideologies or political positions over major issues that could affect the functioning of the government. A good example is the Assam Gan Parishad, that was a Assam movement led by the students against foreigners who came there. Similarly, you have DMK and AIADMK in Tamil Nadu, that is based on the social reform movements of 90s, 30s and 40s. The relation between parties and the political groups cannot be separated and cannot be direct in some cases. They have to work with negotiations. So some of the major drawbacks of the pressure group is it affects the functioning of the democracy because a specific group would have a kind of dominant position, and sometimes there is small public support, but since they have that small pressure group has lot of money, they can hijack the realities and bring a kind of change in the public opinion. The next is the benefits of pressure group. Pressure group is important because it affects the functioning of the rich and the powerful. So because of the pressure group, the small rich and powerful group that is trying to dominate the scenario could be countered by the pressure group who is working around that small rich and powerful group. Again, it is beneficial because it talks about the functioning and achieving dominance over the society. The idea is to hear about the different sections of the society and what the people are actually looking for their own interest. A good example again is the Green Belt movement in Kenya. Now this was led by leader Wangari Maathai, and he basically talked about planting around 30 million trees in Kenya. The idea was government officials in the Kenya at that time were corrupt. There was lot of deforestation activities that was going on, and the trees were sold in the market. As a result, a huge amount of region was witnessing deforestation and cutting of the trees. Under the leadership of Wangari Maathai, the idea was to encourage the local communities to attack another's land, another over the land. So that issue was taken over by Wangari, and he talked that if we are attacking another's land for the sake of getting dominance, as that was led by the President Arap Moi during that time, this could further deteriorate the situation. So the idea was, even if we are retaining the power, the communities are busy fighting over the land, this issue could not be resolved, and the opportunity should be taken by the leadership or by the common people rather than crisscrossing themselves or attacking themselves. So that was one of the good examples where you had a numerous plantation of trees that was witnessed in Kenya. So this is something, a kind of brief intro about the pressure groups and the struggles or the movements that took place across the various parts of the nation and the world. With this, we cover the 5th chapter. We'll be talking about more lectures in the upcoming classes, so stay tuned. Have a very good day ahead. Welcome. We'll talk about the 6th chapter for class 10th NCERT. Here we'll focus on the political parties. Now coming on to the very first issue, why are political parties important? So political parties are basically vehicles of federal change or federal sharing. So they act as power sharing groups. They act as a negotiator between the common man and the political setup or the government, we could say. Now when we talk about a political party, it's definitely required because 100 years back, if we look onto the phenomena, we had only few political parties, and now there are only few nations which do not have political parties. So that's the kind of change that has come over during the period of 100 years, and it's definitely there are a group of people who keep on blaming the various political parties for not achieving the standards, but on the other hand, these political parties are important because they ultimately represent people or give the opinion of the people in front of the government. So they basically bring in laws, bring in amendments, or they have a strong opposition, and that opposition pressurizes the party that's ruling to work on certain issues. So some of the important points that we talk about are, political parties are definitely a group of people who come together to contest the elections with the same ideology or a same mindset, we could say. They try to persuade people why their party is good and why you should follow a certain party or a specific party. They aim to win the popular support. Now what would happen if I stand as an individual candidate? I can win an election, but when it comes to ultimately representation in the parliament or the state legislature, one person cannot represent. So each one, if they are standing as an independent candidate, will not be able to express themselves. So what would happen is, there would be a kind of political division in the society, and formation of these political parties liberalizes the issue or makes this much more easier to express their opinion or bring out a certain change. So these parties, what are their main functions? First of all, contesting the elections, forming various programs and policies for the betterment of the nation, making decisive roles or important decisions for amendment of the law or bringing in a new law, forming and running the government. The next is, those who lose take part in the opposition. So a strong opposition would definitely have a pressure on the ruling party, and therefore there could not be undue changes that could be made in the parliament. Again, an idea is to shape a good public opinion and provide access to the government machinery and welfare schemes. So those are some of the major functions why political parties are important and they are required in the country. The next is, when we talk about the requirement of the political party, the few things that we take into account are, as we said, the independent candidates, even if they win, they cannot have their opinion presented in the government, because for that you need a kind of majority support, and that could be possible only if you are a part of certain political party. To support the government to make policies or bring in any kind of change, you must have a kind of representation, and that representation is brought about by political party. Now political parties could be of different types. There could be one party system where there is a single democratic party that exists, or a single party that exists and rules the country. There could be only two major parties that appear. For example, in US and you have United Kingdom. So in US you have Democrats and Republicans. So just two major parties, and then you have independent candidates that stand. However, India follows a multi-party system. When we talk about a multi-party system, a basic advantage is you try or you provide a competing base for the political parties. And sometimes what happens is, let's say there are 5 political parties, A, B, C and D. Out of that you have total 50 seats. Now if Party A gets 30 seats, then you have a kind of absolute majority, and this Party A would form the government. In another case, you have 5, 10, 10, 15 and 5 seats for the different parties that are allocated. What would happen is, some of the parties would come together to form a coalition government, and that is what is commonly seen when you have a multi-party system. So you have the coalition government that takes place. In India, there have been 3 major alliances in 2004. So NDA, or the National Democratic Alliance, United Progressive Alliance and the Left Front were 3 of those. Now when the party evolves, it evolves with a long history it has. So each party has its own ideology. There was one of the study that was done recently on the state of political parties. The study revealed that political parties are the least trusted institutions in the world. However, the participation in political parties in India is much higher as compared to other nations. The proportion of people who are member of national parties or political parties have increased over the time. People do not enjoy much trust in the political organizations, and the proportion of people who are feeling themselves closely knitted or tied to a political group has increased over the time. So that's just one of the findings based on the survey. Now coming on to the types of political party. In India, we have predominantly 2 types of parties, the national party and the state party. Now the criteria to become a national party and a state party are different. So we'll understand that in a while. However, each national party must register with the Election Commission of India. On registering, they would receive special facilities. They would have a kind of symbol that could be used by the official members only, which are recognized, and therefore recognition of a political party is very, very important. So the criteria to be recognized is very simple. 6% of the total votes to the legislative assemblies in at least 2 of the states would make a state party, and in at least 4 of the Lok Sabha states would make a national party, and along with that you would have 4 seats in Lok Sabha. So that's a kind of summary. We would have a detailed criteria here. So for being a national party, a detailed criteria is getting a recognition as a state party in at least 4 of the states. In the general elections, the party must poll 6% of the votes in 4 of the states and win 4 Lok Sabha seats at least. Along with that, the party should win 2% of the seats in Lok Sabha. As of 2011, there were 11 seats from at least 3 different states. So if all these criteria are fulfilled, we say the party is considered a national party. The NCRT gives 6 as national party. However, as of 2018, we have 7 national parties that are present. The first is the Indian National Congress. This is the oldest party, established in 1885. The idea is basically secularism, welfare of the weaker section, the minority, and supporting the economic reforms. Under Jawaharlal Nehru, huge developments were brought about under the Indian National Congress. Bharatiya Janata Party or BJP is the next party founded in 1980, a kind of recent party with the original name as Bharatiya Jan Sangh. The ideologies are territorial integration of Jammu Kashmir with India, banning the religious conversions, uniform civil code, and so those are some of the major ideas that are laid under Bharatiya Janata Party or BJP. The next is All India Trinamool Congress, founded in 98, very recently by Mamata Banerjee, with the party symbol as flower and glass. Bahujan Samaj Party, formed by Kashi Ram in 1984 after formation of BJP. The idea was to help the Bahujan Samaj, or the section which includes the Dalit, Adivasi, OBC or religious minorities. The next is CPIM. Now CPIM separated from CPI. So CPI was founded in 1925. Later on CPIM broke from this party and you had the formation in 1964. CPIM is Marxist and believes in the Marxist and Leninist philosophy. So socialism, secularism and democracy are the key points. It is mainly seen in West Bengal, Kerala and Tripura, and it supports the poor, factory farmers, factory workers and labourers. The CPI, that's the Communist Party of India, is opposed to the forces of communalism, and this splitted into CPIM in 1964 that we have already seen. CPI is present mainly in Kerala, West Bengal, Punjab, Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. The next important party is Nationalist Congress Party, present in Maharashtra, Meghalaya, Manipur and Assam. It believes in democracy, Gandhian secularism, social justice and federalism. So the key aspects of each party are important and it has been found in 1999. Now coming on to the state party, the criteria is the party should win minimum 3% of the total seats and minimum 3 seats in state legislature, should win at least 1 seat in Lok Sabha for every 25 seats, or should secure 6% of the valid votes in an election to Lok Sabha or State Assembly and win at least 1 Lok Sabha seat and 2 Legislative Assembly seats. Finally, a recognition of state party is considered if it secures 8% of or more of the total valid votes polled in the state. Some of the common state parties are Sikkim Democratic Front, Mizo Nationalist Front and Biju Janata Dal Party. Now here you have a map of India with different state parties ruling into the different states. So that's very important. We have around 750 political parties that have been recognized. Now what are the challenges to the political parties? Sometimes people express dissatisfaction based on the work that the political party has been doing. There is lack of internal democracy. So the concentration of power comes in the hand of only few of the people. As a result, the party cannot maintain a kind of equity or equality among its members. The next is dynasty succession. So the son and the grandsons from the same party join the party. Money and muscle power again plays an important role in political party. Then sometimes these parties do not offer a kind of meaningful choices. For example, in Britain you have Labour Party and Conservative Party with a very meager difference between the ideologies of two, and it's mainly on the fundamental aspects that they agree, but some differences on the policy implementation that could be seen. Now when we talk about reforming a political party, defection is a major thing. So under defection what happens is, you win election from a certain party, then for money you switch on to another party. So you have the Anti-Defection Law Act that came into being. So Constitution amended the law to prevent MPs and MLAs from changing their parties. So that was the anti-defection. Then you had the law to regulate the internal affairs or the internal matters of the political party that's required, making it mandatory for 1/3 of the women to participate in the political parties, providing state funding of the elections. So all these are important. However, in certain cases, if there are over regulations, it can definitely be harmful, because when there are over regulations, it would force the parties to find alternate ways to cheat. It would also, the parties would not agree with the law that are being formed, and ultimately they are the one who would be passing the law, so they won't pass the law. So therefore, over regulation can be harmful. So whatever they don't like or they are not convinced with would not be ultimately passed. So political parties can improve if those who want to join it wholeheartedly, and it basically depends on the degree of public participation participation, the trust and the level of transparency or accountability or responsibility among the citizens or the people who are joining the political parties. So it's good to have a better politics rather than a bad political party. So those are the things that have been discussed and covered in this chapter. We'll be covering the last two chapters for the political science and then we'll switch to history for class 10. So stay tuned for further updates. Have a very good day ahead. Hello, welcome. We'll start with NCERT class 10, the 7th chapter for political science. Now this chapter exclusively talks about the outcomes of democracy. In the chapters so far, we have been understanding how democracy works, what has been the scenario in India and other nations, and how these nations have tried to attain democracy over the time. So previously, many of the nations were fighting from either monarchy or dictatorship, and slowly and gradually they attained democracy. Now when we talk about the outcomes of democracy, definitely it's people-centric because people are directly involved in it. The next is it tries to maintain the equality of the people or equality among the people, as well as it tries to maintain the economic well-being and provide freedom and dignity to an individual. Now let's have two examples. Let's say I have an example where I have Hitler as a dictator and another nation where you have democracy that is seen. Now what would happen in the two examples? In the example where you have a dictator, he has an independence to take any decision anytime he wants. So the decision making process would definitely be quick, but here it would be through negotiations, there would be arguments, disarguments, and finally the outcome would be there, and there would be certain norms which would be prescribed based on which the decisions could be taken. So definitely there is a contrast between a kind of dictatorship government or a monarchy form of government where the decisions can be much quicker, but the implementation when it comes to the common man, it might not be in favor of the common man, but for a democracy the decisions are maximum in favor of the common man, and therefore we say it's a kind of people-centric approach. Now why we say democracy is better? So that is one thing that we have talked about. Other important things include it provides equality to all citizens. So everyone is equal in democracy and everyone is given equal opportunities and equal rights. The dignity and the freedom of an individual is maintained. The quality of decision making definitely improves because the inputs are more. So let's say this dictator has to take a decision. He has only the ideas that are coming to his mind or to his closest cabinet, but here you would have a kind of participatory approach where lots and lots of inputs and ideas could be taken into consideration, and where you have lots of ideas that are taken into consideration, definitely the results would be much better and much people-centric. Again, resolution of conflicts become much easier in case of democracy, and there is also the room to correct a lots of mistakes that are happening in reality. So democracy is good in principle, but we say it's not that good in practice. Why? Because the attainment of democracy has been different in different economic situations, different social situations. So we have seen how the things have taken place. We have talked about the countries like Nepal, where there was a third wave of independence or a third wave of democracy that was seen. So all those vary with country, with situation, but under democracy what would happen is definitely there would be elections, there would be formation of constitutions, there would be parties, and people or the citizens would be guaranteed certain rights. So those are definitely the added advantage that a democratic government witnesses. Again, if something does not work good, what happens is we try to blame the democracy or doubt the democracy. So what happens as a result is the democracy tries to achieve something and then it tries to rectify the mistake that it has already done. In a country like India, where you have a huge lot of population, the statistics reveal that the countries where dictatorship is a form of government, the economic growth is much better as compared to a democratic nation. Now, definitely, has been what has been statistically proved, but what happens when it comes to a country like India? We have a huge base of poor population that resides in the nation. Now, when we have a huge base of poor population, what would happen? Since you have a huge base of poor population that is seen, these poor population or the kind of huge population that is being witnessed becomes the vote bank, and therefore the parties try to have or promote most of the ideas or most of the philosophies in favor of them. However, that should be what should happen practically, but still there are cases where this is not being taken care of, and ultimately the situation worsens. Again, an important concept under governance, or what we talk about democracy, is the concept of art. Under art, we simply say there are three terms that we need to focus on: A for accountability, R for responsibility, and T for transparency. So those three are the basic key factors of the governance. So when we talk about good governance, we talk about that government should be accountable to the people, it should take the responsibility of the common man, and there should be transparency in the system so that whatever takes place is in the public. And a good idea for this was the RTI Act, that is Right to Information Act. So Right to Information Act would be a kind of act that would work towards bringing in more transparency into the system, because now you have the right to question why this had happened or bring out the statistics on certain events. So those are the things that we take into consideration when we talk about the governance or the government functioning. Now, definitely we have talked about how negotiations work in democracy, and democracy you have decision making that takes place through the procedure of norms. Now, what are some of the good examples to examine how the decision making takes place through a standard procedure? So definitely we have free and fair elections, we have open public debates on major policies, and the Right to Information Act is one of the important acts that we discuss here. Again, democracy needs to be free from corruption. So being free from corruption is again a step towards better transparency in the system. And when you have the people who are working as a part of the government, it becomes more legitimate, you are more answerable, and people are willing to be ruled by the people from among themselves. So that's the best point of a democratic government. We have already seen how economic growth has been varying in a dictatorship nation, in a nation where there is dictatorship versus democracy. If we look onto the statistics, in the nations where there are democracy like South Africa and Brazil, top 20 people have 60% of the national income. Now this brings in huge amount of economic disparity or economic gap between the rich and the poor, which is visible predominantly in the democratic societies, and the bottom 3% is with 20% of the people. So bottom 3% of the has 20% of the population. So that's basically a big amount that we need to work around, and therefore working on economic disparities is another important issue that we need to mention under democracy, because under democracy we definitely believe in political equality, but bringing in economic equality is again important. The next important aspect is accommodating the kind of social divisions. It's very important that if a majority comes to power, this majority should not overrule the minority. So minority should be given equal representation if possible, or they should be part of the democratic setup, and once these minority are considered into the mainstream, then only we can say we have a kind of successful democracy, because a successful democracy would accommodate all the kind of social divisions that exist into the society. Again, if we see that there is someone who is being barred, then the democracy ceases to operate in that case, and we say that democracy is not accommodative for that person. So barring someone is not a correct option unless and until the person is considered medically or mentally unfit. So those are the cases we keep an exception on. The next is dignity and freedom of an individual, that we have already talked about. So every individual wants respect from others, and as a result we talk about dignity and respect and freedom as the basis for democracy. Now dignity includes dignity of women, treating them equally. Wage struggle is again important, so equal remuneration, equal wages, strengthening the claims of disadvantaged caste, and these are some of the major points that we talk about. So it's basically what makes a difference is the vote, and this vote determines what kind of government would come into action. And once the government comes into action, the concept of art comes in, that's the government should be accountable, responsible and transparent for a better functioning. And more people's participation and people's involvement would help a better government come up with more suggestions, more ideas and more creative approach. So with this we cover the basic outcomes of democracy. We are left with only one chapter in political science. After that we'll start with history class 10. So stay tuned for further updates. Have a very good day ahead. Welcome. This would be our last class for class 10 political science, and in this class we would be discussing the various challenges related to democracy. In the last class we have already discussed what are the benefits and the outcomes of the process of democracy. Now let's look into the broader challenges that we face. Now challenge is basically a difficulty. Now a person can pursue or preview a kind of difficulty as a problem, but for democracy, we say we have to take this challenge as an opportunity to progress. So let's consider I have a challenge A in hand. I consider this as an opportunity to improve and progress further. So that is where we take the concept of challenge in democracy. So there are three challenges we talk about. The first is the foundational challenge. Now this challenge talks about establishment of a democracy. So when we are trying to establish a democracy, there was previously a monarchy or a dictatorship, and there was waves and rounds of independence and democracy that moved out. We have gone through this in the class 9th and 10th history as well as political science, the changes in the countries like France, Nepal and other nations which have witnessed the idea of democracy, the fall and the rise of democracy many a times. So that is the foundational challenge towards establishing a democracy, the very first challenge. The second challenge talks about expansion, applying it across the region, across the state and across the country. This kind of challenge has been faced by countries like India, countries like United States. The third kind of challenge we talk about is deepening of the democracy. Now, deepening of the democracy means we need to strengthen the structure of democratic setup so that the other monarchy or dictatorship does not overrule this setup, and therefore we talk about deepening of the democracy, which is very important. And deepening of the democracy ultimately brings down the role of the rich and the powerful and brings each and everyone at an equal stake. So therefore we say there are three primary challenges on democracy. I repeat, it's first the foundational challenge, second is the expansion of democracy, and third is deepening the roots of democracy. Now considering this, we have gone through the various case studies that we have referred throughout this class 10th. We have talked about examples from South Africa, Myanmar, France, Nepal, Poland, Chile, how things have worked around. Now what are the kinds of challenges that each and every country face? So the challenges would differ for each and every country. For some countries there could be social challenges, for other countries there could be economic challenges. Some of the common challenges are given here. So first is designing a good constitution, bringing out the democratic rights. Now the democratic rights that were brought about in India, the fundamental rights, differed from what were given in South Africa that we have seen in the previous chapters. The next is working of the institutions, the procedure for the elections, the idea of decentralization, how we have worked around the decentralization, the Panchayati Raj system, the 73rd and the 74th Amendment Act. Then the accommodation of the diversity, the diverse culture, the diverse languages, the diverse ethnicity in India have been covered, and finally the political organization, which we have covered in the previous few chapters. So considering these challenges, there are numerous political reforms that must be brought about. Now these political reforms are also known as the democratic reforms or the political reforms. Let's say there is a car, there is a model of the car given by Mercedes and another given by Maruti. Now definitely if you go to a mechanic, the parts required would differ. Definitely the input, the process by which you would repair would differ. Similarly, every democratic nation cannot have the same recipe for political reforms. Let's say the political reforms that we are trying to bring in India would be very different from a country like United States. So the same rules and the same formulas cannot apply to each and every nation. So it should be carefully devised based on the requirement of the citizens and the nation where you are living. For example, let's say we have another important example here. When we talk about cricket, the changes in the LBW tactics reduced the negative batting tactics, and therefore it improved the quality of the cricket match. So we are bringing the changes in the law, and these changes in the law would positively affect the functioning of democracy. So that's another way we talk about reforms. The third is, sometimes these laws could become counterproductive. For example, if we bring in a law that there is a ban for people who can contest elections if they have more than 2 children. So that's the kind of idea that works around against a democratic principle, and it's kind of counterproductive. So political actors would not be interested in it. It would empower certain section of the society, and the poor or the women will not be able to take part in it. So working around corruption, working or controlling corruption is one idea, but we must make sure this idea does not prove counterproductive for a set of people. The next is, there should be democratic reforms that are brought about by political practice. Now how this can be done? This can be done by increasing people's participation, bringing in new ideas, generating new themes by the ordinary people, and therefore we look towards a good solution and an implementation of the problem. So when we talk about redefining democracy, what we need to look at? We need to look at the idea of elections, how the rulers or the present ruling party is looking into the needs of the people, whether they are able to fulfill the needs of the people. Election is offering an equal choice for the candidates. The ideas that have been laid down in the election campaign are being followed, and related changes have been taking place or not. Opportunity is available to each and everyone or not. The choices that are available are exercised to the best possible scenario or not, and if there is any kind of discrimination based on caste, religion or gender, it should be abolished. So those are some of the major things we talk about when we talk about redefining the idea of democracy. Now we have two case studies here. We have one case study from UP where doctors are posted into the rural areas, but they are not found in the place of their posting. They are either on leave or they don't have a kind of 100% attendance. What could be the reforms? So we have some ideas here that could be a part of reform. Now what do you think would be a kind of optimum reform or a best reform as an administrator would be very interesting to understand, because someone can say you can terminate that officer, but that wouldn't be a good choice, because once you terminate it, the person who comes next might do or repeat the same thing. You can carry surprise rates, so that's sometimes done to check the attendance. Panchayat should write the annual report of the doctors, and the next suggestion says there should be breaking down of the state further. So further decentralization or further smaller states should be created, but that again won't address the problem. That would again bring up the idea of corruption. So those are the kind of reforms that could be possible. Or there could be any other suggestions that you could think of. The next is, a candidate who is contesting the election usually holds ample property. Usually the statistics show it's around 1 crore or more. Now if we consider this as a fact, it proves that democracy or politics is only meant for the rich. Now, what could be the reforms that could be done to bring in the voice of the poor into political setup? First is the financial account of every political party should be kept open. The funding for the election procedure should be given by the state so that even the poor can participate. Citizens should be encouraged to provide more donations to the political party so that the poor candidate who is contesting the election can take the funds from the political party. So those are kind of some of the reforms that we could think about. So that's a kind of brainstorming activity where you have to think about the act and the reform or the various things that could be done to improve that. We have covered all the chapters of political science for class 10th. We would be starting with history class 10th and we aim to complete that before your board exam on 22nd. So stay tuned for further updates. If you have any doubts, leave those as comment below the video. We'll be happy to resolve those. Have a good day ahead.